I would like to welcome you all to today's Digital Trade Alliance webinar. I'm Deepika Yadav, coordinator for Digital Trade Alliance. DTA is a cooperative effort of digital rights and consumer groups from the Global South and Global North. We come together to share ideas, collaborate, and produce needed research to inform the debate at the intersection of digital rights and digital trade issues. In today's webinar, the post-Brexit push for deregulation in global data governance, we will be presenting one such research which has been commissioned by DTA. This research looks into the UK's post-Brexit strategy to promote deregulation in global digital trade and data governance through a number of new free trade agreements and domestic data protection reforms. The recent accession for various agreements by UK prioritized digital trade and data flows over consumer protections. We see UK transforming its domestic data protection framework to depart from the EU approach in the areas such as identifiable information, research, automated decisions, data rights, and business obligations. And to talk about this topic, we have, I would like to introduce our panelists today. We have Alex Lawrence Archer from AWO. Alex is a solicitor in England and Wales, working on advisory and contentious data rights matters. He advises clients on digital rights impacts of the UK government's proposed reforms in data protection and digital information bill, as well as the government's approach to technology regulation more broadly. He has also given evidence to the UK Parliament on the bill. Yanis Kouvakis from Privacy International. He's a senior legal officer and assistant general counsel at Privacy International, a London-based nonprofit organization that campaigns against unlawful government and corporate surveillance globally. He leads PI's work on cybersecurity as well as data competition while assisting colleagues with managing legal risk. We have Javier Ruiz. He's consultant with the Digital Trade Alliance. Javier is an independent consultant covering a broad range of digital and technology policy and advocacy areas. He's an expert advisor to the UK government on digital trade and intellectual property. Javier is the former policy director of the Open Rights Group, and he's also the author of this report, which is now available on DTA website. Please see the link in comment section. And without much delay, I would now like to hand over to Javier to start with his presentation. Javier, on to you.
Hello, thanks. Thanks a lot, Deepika. So I am going to share some slides to I'll start sharing first. And okay, so yeah, I think you can hopefully see my slides. And so I'm not going to repeat all of what we have in the report, because there is quite a lot of detail there on all the trade agreements, but I'm just going to give an overview. I'm going to give mainly an overview of the, of what is the current state of UK digital policy, particularly around trade, and how this has quite a broad impact, not just on people in the UK, but also in terms of the global regulation of data and technology. And here, this like the four main things that we are seeing is that the UK has been, since Brexit, very, very active in trying to get new trade agreements. I mean, although the reality is that most of those are continuity, there are all the new UK trade agreements have got clauses that relate to digital regulation, particularly on data and algorithms or source code, and those could have quite important effects. Then the other element that we are seeing is that it's not just creating trade agreements everywhere, but very specifically and very openly trying to move away from Europe and towards the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific area, as it's sometimes called, which is perceived as the center of the global economy. And that is obviously potentially that potentially has lots of wider implications in terms of regulation and policies. And then accompanying that, there is an agenda to try to change data protection to drive potentially growth and try to also lower rights that are perceived by government as an obstacle to economic progress. And then coupling those domestic reforms, and part of those domestic reforms, but also with wider implications, are new changes to the data protection frameworks for data transfers. Those are the legal mechanisms that allow data from people in the UK to go to other third-party countries. And those, and here the idea, the overall theme is that the UK is trying to position itself as a kind of hub and channel that will allow data to flow from the EU, the US, and potentially Asia-Pacific countries, but very importantly, not China. That's seen as like the, at the moment, like the main opponent. And then we also have a last minute push quite recently to also include, to become a global leader on the regulation of AI safety. But, to be honest, that seems a little bit far out at the moment. So I'm just going into this topic. So UK trade agreements. So here in this map, I mean, I'm not covering all of the trade agreements, but just to give you an. So yeah, so basically what we have here is like the countries in orange, the countries in red, so Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and Ukraine are the countries where the UK has created brand new trade agreements that have digital components. Then the countries in orange are those countries that are part of what is called the Comprehensive Partnership for the Trade, the CPTPP, which is basically like the trade partnership for the Pacific. And those also include Australia, Japan, and New Zealand. And then, there, in addition to those countries, we have some countries in yellow, which are the countries that the UK ideally would have as priorities, which are the US, India, and also the Gulf countries. And I put Kenya as well, because we know that it is a big priority in the longer term, although it's now the negotiations are in a bit of a hiatus. So those are the main, so that what that shows us that the UK is really moving out of Europe and really going all around the world. Now, most of the trade agreements that are not in that map that the UK has signed since Brexit are mainly continuity deals, as they are called, which simply are designed to continue the agreement that the UK enjoyed as part of the European Union after Brexit. And those things were necessary because in some cases, in most cases, they were like nominal continuity. In other cases, they needed a renegotiation because obviously the deal when the UK was one of 28 is not the same as the UK being a standalone country. But overall, most of those agreements don't have any digital clauses that would affect digital regulation. Now, CPTPP, that is really the biggest game changer potentially, because it has not only digital trade clauses, and like the same as the ones found in Japan or Australia, or similar, but also it has potentially quite strong enforcement mechanisms, including mechanisms for private companies to sue governments. So it's called investor-state dispute resolution. So CPTPP is, it is potentially quite a big change. Now, those deals and the new deals with Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, they include text that we say, in digital chapters that copies both what is in the CPTPP and generally the US policy to digital trade, which actually informs CPTPP, but then the US pulled out of CPTPP in the last minute before they signed it, but they were the architects of a lot of the treaty. And those include a ban on the localization of computer facilities, which is basically you cannot force a company to set up a computer server in your country in order to operate there. You must allow the free flow of data, which means that restrictions on data, they're allowed, but they have to follow very narrow exceptions. And there are mandatory data protection frameworks, which sounds good in principle, but unfortunately, what is understood as the data protection framework has quite a low standard. And then there are also restrictions on access to source code, which means that you cannot force a company to give you access to their source code or algorithms in order to operate in the country. So those are kind of like the core elements of digital trade policies that we find in the deals with Japan, Australia, New Zealand. The one in New Zealand actually doesn't have measures on source code because the Maori managed to remove those, and showing actually one of the few cases where participatory approaches have changed the trade deal, because they were concerned about the impact of restrictions on access on their own traditional knowledge. So that is one of the few exceptions. So we have those deals, and then we have a new type of partnership with Singapore, which is called a digital economic partnership agreement, and that is a little bit different from the CPTPP and the other agreements. Includes things like artificial intelligence or digital IDs, but at the same time has got slightly weaker enforcement mechanisms. And it's kind of a new experimental type of trade agreement that is becoming very popular in the Pacific, and the UK is basically dipping its toes into that approach. So those are like really what the main trade agreements we have now. Then, of course, the UK very publicly after Brexit signaled that they wanted to have a trade agreement with the US, which is stalled. And for the past year and a half, the government has also been negotiating a trade agreement with India, which is also slow due to things like access to foreign workers or disagreements over data and quite a few other things. But of course, if those things come through, they're going to have quite a huge impact in terms of the UK trade. So what are some of the criticisms that we've seen of the UK trade approach, which I developed a bit more in the report? So for quite a few years, there was a criticism from many quarters, from businesses, from policy experts, that there was a lack of coherence, that the idea of trade after Brexit was mainly, let's just make as many trade deals as possible to show that we can be independent from the EU. But when you actually look at the benefits of those agreements, it's not very clear that they're actually going to deliver for the UK. For example, the agreement with Australia, has been severely criticized by farmers, for just being quite a bad deal. But it seems that the idea was that you need to get deals. Now, the current Trade Secretary, Kemi Badenoch, has put a clear headline, with what they call the race to $1 trillion, which is the idea that the UK should just focus on growth, and that trade agreement should deliver at least £1 trillion of goods and services to be sold annually by 2030, which is a kind of, I think, around the 20% or more, 30% growth. Now, growth and the details, there is not very clear yet how the detail of the agreements are going to deliver, but at least this is now a clear focus. Now, one of the main criticisms of UK trade policy, digital trade, but also all trade policies, the lack of scrutiny by Parliament and also in the public, and the fact that, at the moment, there have been very, very little discussion, of their objectives and also the negotiations. And this is actually quite a big problem, particularly when it comes to digital, where the trade is not just trade, but actually affects many areas of people's lives as they go about, using the internet. And then, of course, the criticism from the point of view of digital trade is what we said before. If you if you remove potential policy restrictions on data flows, data could go to countries where there are no protections. It would enable what's called data laundering, where you avoid regulation by sending the data elsewhere. And if you remove the possibility to demand access to algorithms or source code, you could also restrict the accountability of new systems, for example, like all the discussion around generative AI, which in some cases, people want to know how those systems work. Now, this tilt to the Pacific, what we said before, this is, again, like the big part of the UK policy. The idea is that, as we said, the Pacific is where everything is happening. Europe is the past. And although this is seen sometimes as a kind of a shift also from the focus on the US, in reality, this is also still quite connected to US policy, because all of the underlying initiatives are actually supporting US policy, particularly with things like, for example, encircling China and trying to create like a stronger bloc. Also important, one very important thing about the shift to the Pacific is that actually that area is where most of the new innovations around data and digital governance are happening, like, for example, the digital partnership that we mentioned before, but also quite a few other initiatives. And impact of this shift, and all of that is that if you combine the innovations on data and also the very, very different approach that the CPTPP, the Asia Pacific bloc, and that the whole region takes to digital, it's potentially quite problematic, because I think the fundamental difference is that in the Asia Pacific region, data is all about economics and facilitating growth. In Europe, is fundamentally personal data is a fundamental right, the protection of personal data. And that is a really absolute fundamental dichotomy that at the moment, no one has explained very well how you can bridge. And now, I mean, this is not to say that the UK could not be part of that broader framework. I mean, as we said, like the Pacific is a very large area. And if you look at the distance, both in region, in geography, and also in values and regulation between, say, Vietnam and Chile, and you put the UK, you can see actually that potentially the UK and Chile are closer than Vietnam. So I don't think that you should dismiss it, and just laugh it up. But I think that the understanding the implications of this shift, would be quite important. And then, of course, as we move to the Pacific, what about Europe? Well, Europe is still there. There is a trade and cooperation agreement that actually includes quite unique clauses on data protection that many people thought that were designed to protect the regulatory autonomy of the EU, the UK not challenging EU's GDPR, but in reality also protect the UK if the UK wanted to diverge from the current framework. So that could be actually a problematic point for the European Union if they ever wanted to challenge the UK. And then obviously the UK is now out of some of the newer regulations on digital, like Digital Services Act, AI Act, and this divergence starting to show. And we still don't understand in practice how it's going to work. I mean, obviously the UK is doing parallel things sometimes, but there is a lot of confusion, and in some areas like AI, outright divergence. So this is going to be quite complicated. Now, the relation between data regulation and trade, is basically very openly, the idea is that data regulation is there to help trade, is the handmaid of trade and growth. And this is a very open policy right now from the government, This is particularly shown in the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, which I'm not going to go into much detail, as is going to be discussed by Alex and others. But, basically it is openly defined as a pro-growth regulation where rights are seen as obstacles, and there are changes, to access and several other areas. It was also openly and very publicly co-designed with businesses, but ignoring the perspective of everyone else, like civil society. And the final result, or what we have in the bill before, which is going through amendments, but even the second version of the bill, the text that is being discussed, is already a little bit less radical than the initial ideas that were presented by government in consultation, but it's still potentially quite problematic. And we think, some of us think that the reason why the government feels that this is a priority is not just the idea that data is an economic, data could be used to promote more economic growth, but also that this is a very popular policy, that many people see GDPR as like this big, EU cumbersome, problem transatlantic of laws, So then, just to also add, that obviously not everything in that bill is a problem from the point of view of civil society or human rights. There are some good things like changes to nuisance calls, and also complicated issues around digital identity and many other things to unpick. But overall, it's a problem. Many civil society groups have called for the bill to be withdrawn directly. Now, independently of what's in the bill, the idea of data transfers, as we said before, being like there just to help trade, that is now an official policy. Now we can question whether that is actually simply a more honest position, rather than what the EU and others say, that it's all about, trying to enable data, finding common legal frameworks, and ultimately it seems that the EU are also quite, they also make data adequacy decisions on the basis of trade. The UK is just being very, very open, and as we said, there are new adequacy decisions that the UK has developed, Japan, Korea, but also it also carries all the older decisions from the EU. Now, when it comes to new decisions, the UK, the bill, and this is one of the few references to I'm making here to the bill, is that the standard, the criteria for giving adequacy, which means that you enable data flows to that region as if they were domestic data flows, which means that you don't need to get an extra contract, only just like a normal domestic paperwork, which is quite a big thing. So the new criteria is that this restriction should not be, that the foreign protection standards should be not materially lower than in the UK. And right now, the criteria inherited from the EU is that the protection should be essentially equivalent. Now, the one reading could be that this doesn't mean anything. The other is that actually this means that really that you will try to focus more on actual harms and the practicalities and trying to focus a bit less on what the law says. So even if you have a country where laws are not very good, you can say, well, actually, in practice, is this really going to be a problem or not? And then try to find a way of still get the data through, which obviously could be actually an issue. Now, and then something else that we are seeing as a change is a change in terminology, where the UK now doesn't talk about adequacy decisions, they talk about building data bridges. Again, some of this could be just a change in the word, just to signal that the UK is not the EU. In practice, it could also be quite a different approach. I mean, the fact that there are the regulation of adequacy is already been a little bit different, and also could involve a new type of instruments, which is something that the UK seems to be quite keen on trying to create new bespoke agreements and transfers, which we'll look at in a second. Now, again, as with the bill, is there room for improvement on the process of data transfers? Yes, a lot. The process that we inherited from the EU, and particularly the EU process, is really slow. It's not very transparent, and there is a lot that could be done better, And also, it's important to say that adequacy, civil society, they always focus on adequacy, but for consumers and for ordinary people, it's still a problem. When data goes to other country with or without adequacy, it's not easy to enforce their rights. And also, it's not 100% guaranteed that problems are not going to happen. I mean, it's just telling you that the legal regime in that country should work. If a company doesn't comply with the local regime in that country, then you're still stuck with the problem. So now, as we said before, the data agreements data bridges being more than adequacy, we don't know exactly how far they will expand, but we know that the UK has made a very open policy that they wanted to start opening data partnerships, as they were called, with countries that at the moment, definitely don't have an EU adequacy, like Australia, US, India, and Colombia. Now, if this happens, and this is taken despite the fact that the US and the EU are negotiating some sort of new data agreement, but this is very clearly an example of the UK becoming this kind of data hub and where data regimes can coexist, but it obviously creates risks to adequacy, and those are not clear yet. I think that's something that probably people will want to discuss. So now I'm going to rattle through the next things to hurry up. So now the big innovation in terms of data, a bit like CPTPP was for trade, the big thing for the UK is actually joining the global cross-border privacy rules, which is defined or sold as the alternative to GDPR. This has happened with pretty much zero debate. And just to explain, I mean, the CBPR is a system that comes from the Asia-Pacific regime, but now has been open to countries worldwide. It's a system of private certification, and it's definitely not the same as adequacy. It's actually potentially quite expensive for organizations to go through that. And at the moment, it's not clear again, how the UK is going to make this compatible with GDPR. We can discuss later, how countries like Japan, for example, are trying to make those systems compatible, which at the moment seems to be by segregating data. And I think that if that came to the UK, it would probably be quite an issue for companies. But this is potentially a big thing if the UK really joins this. And then, of course, just mention very briefly that is now, in terms of data, the UK initiatives in global data governance are now joined by trying to also be at the lead of the regulation of AI. And fortunately, this is happening as the UK is also trying to help the US water down the Council of Europe treaty on AI by, for example, making it only apply to the public sector and not to private companies. So I think that it's worth for civil society groups to watch this space, but mainly because whatever new agreement, could be actually a poor agreement based on the evidence of what we're seeing in the Council of Europe. Now, just to give like a bit the helicopter view. So why is all of this stuff from the UK and how does it fit in the bigger global picture? So the big thing on data governance now is the idea of interoperability, because harmonization is too hard. We need to make things interoperable, and which means that you can connect different regimes while maintaining data rights. And this is kind of a holy grail of data, and it would be great. Unfortunately, no one has able to define it or find exactly how it's going to work. I mean, this is happening as well, this idea of interoperability, and at the same time, as we see what's called a forum shifting for data regulation, trying to create spaces at the global level where data can be regulated in a way that is potentially more amenable to businesses. And there are discussions at the World Economic Forum, potentially at the World Trade Organization, and the OECD as like the new big spaces, which unfortunately, apart from the OECD, they don't have a big space for civil society at the moment. But this could change. And then even more helicopter view. So we have forum shifting, interoperability, and then the rest is obviously the UK trying to play the kind of plucky island, navigating and being the kingmaker between all of this in the world of big data geopolitics. And this is like, so there is a main narrative right now that there are three big regulatory blocks in the world: the EU, which is all about rights, the US, which is all about money and data flows, and China, which is all about the state surveillance. This is not that simple, and of course there are many countries out of those blocks, but the issues under discussion, I mean, there is a fair simplification, but it's not clear that it's so, but it's not that clear cut. Now, these are the issues underlying this, and actually the discussions that the UK should really be having in a more public way are things around data sovereignty or digital sovereignty, and how this works with privacy and accountability, but also from the point of view of many countries, the idea of justice and access to technology, and the fact that they want to have access to new digital technologies, and they're trying to restrict data in order to enable domestic growth. I mean, it's not clear whether that will actually work or not, but at least there's a discussion that we cannot ignore. And then, of course, data, keeping data in a country and restricting data flows could also have a negative impact in countries like China, where it will basically enable the government to keep surveillance in the local population if they're not allowed to use Gmail or other services. And then behind a lot of this is the dreaded issue of internet fragmentation, balkanization, splinter nets, and many other terms that basically mean that if we allow this idea of completely different regimes to fester, eventually we'll break up the internet. So just, to finish, so, I mean, these are some big things now. The UK is very active, and at the moment is really a disruptor, but could it actually be a positive influence, let's say, and then, I mean, I think that in some cases, there are some good things coming out of these discussions. One is the understanding that actually trade and data are connected, and particularly that the economic well-being of people cannot just be ignored. We cannot say, well, data is just about fundamental rights and we don't care about the money, because for many people, everyone has to eat, and data is going to be part of that. Then, of course, the idea of data interoperability, is actually important. We cannot just say, keep GDPR is the best standard in the world, and everyone else, can just basically find their own way. I mean, I think definitely you need interoperability. You cannot just tell every country to go, and build their own rules, but at the same time, that should be based on higher standards, and giving up on harmonization, I think that may be a bit too early for that, Then again, the drive to the Pacific, I mean, ironically, I think it could work. I mean, it's not something that you should just dismiss, like the UK is very far, I mean, but the risk to the EU relations are real, and everyone in the UK, every business, every organization says that the EU should be a priority if there is a risk. Then, of course, the UK could be a leader. The governor always wants to be world-class and world leader, and they could become a world leader in scrutiny and transparency. Unfortunately, right now, they are the opposite, pretty much, but that would be a good thing that they could do. And then, and in that sense, the UK could also be promoting a more multi-stakeholder approach to global governance, where instead of trying to move things to the WTO, for example, you could try to explore new spaces. So sorry, that took quite a lot longer, but that's the presentation, and just thank you.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you for that very informative presentation. On to Alex now. Alex, I'm handing it over to you now.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'll get right into it. I'm going to speak about the law as it relates to international data transfers from the UK and how that's changed and is forecast to change with the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill that Javi's mentioned. So at Brexit, the UK copy-pasted the EU GDPR into domestic law, renamed it the UK GDPR, and effectively substituted the words European Union for United Kingdom throughout. And that included the regime for international transfers in Chapter 5 and adequacy decisions. So in terms of international transfers from the UK, very little changed at the point of Brexit as to how they're legally regulated. And since then, the UK has, despite perhaps how it might have wanted to represent things internationally, has effectively moved pretty much in lockstep with the EU as further adequacy decisions have been granted to other countries like Japan and Korea. The bill will change this situation. It creates a new UK-specific regime for international transfers in Schedule 5, which inserts a new Chapter 5 into the UK GDPR. So, albeit that this is a new UK-specific regime governing international transfers, actually, when you start looking at it, it's very familiar. So basically, it deals with standard contractual clauses, binding corporate rules, derogations for specific situations, which are very, very rarely applicable, and what are known as approval regulations. And this is effectively a mechanism by which data adequacy will be granted in future by the Secretary of State of the relevant UK department to third countries or international organizations. So it works quite similarly to the current regime, but with some subtle differences. And those subtle differences are most evident in relation to approval regulations. So Javier has already touched on the most obvious headline difference, which is that the test legally that needs to be met in order for the Secretary of State to be able to make approval regulations in relation to a third country or international organization has changed from the standard of data protection being essentially equivalent to that in the UK to not materially lower. It's not completely clear what's intended by that change, but you can start to see what it means when you look at some of the other changes that are there. Another thing that's been removed is that the Secretary of State does not need to consider whether or not there's an independent regulator in relation to data protection. That's a difference from the factors that need to be taken into account by the European Commission. Similarly, there's no need to take into account whether there are judicial remedies available for breaches of data protection in a third country, so that the redress can be non-judicial. That's an important difference between the UK's new regime and the EU's. The Secretary of State is specifically enabled to take into account different traditions in countries which might be granted UK adequacy through approval regulations. And the Secretary of State must consider the desirability of facilitating international data transfers. So there's a kind of group of changes there, which fairly clearly evince an intention for the UK to be granting own data adequacy to a broader list of destinations than enjoy it from the European Union. And the legislation seems designed to make that legally possible, assuming that the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill does become law. In terms of what the UK is planning to do with that new freedom, Javier talked about this quite extensively, and it does look like there is an intention to make use of it to do just that, right? To grant adequacy to countries that don't enjoy it from the European Union. That's evident from things like CBPR. I've had that confirmed to me directly by representatives of the relevant UK government department. It's even in the consultation for the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill. So there's clearly that intention. That intention, it cuts against other things that the UK government are saying. So the UK government have consistently, very strongly stressed that maintaining EU adequacy for the UK is among their top priorities. And the approach that has been taken in relation to the US data bridge, so effectively UK granting adequacy to the US, is that that's been a complete back-to-back of the EU approach. I spoke about this with a representative of the UK government department recently, who said, in fact, the UK effectively cannot and will not go ahead with its own data bridge to the US until the EU-US agreement is in place, because UK data subjects will need to be able to use exactly the same redress mechanisms as are being negotiated between the EU and the US. So it's quite a close alignment there. That means that the UK's policy can be described as a little bit confused, I guess. A high priority placed on maintaining adequacy from the EU, and in practice continuing to cleave quite closely to what the EU is doing, whilst at the same time planning to pull away potentially quite sharply and raising the very real prospect that personal data originating in the EU could pass to the UK under the UK's adequacy decision from the Commission, and then onward from the UK to destinations which don't enjoy an adequacy decision from the European Commission. And what that probably means, or what that probably will mean, is some kind of geofencing, like technical and legal geofencing, which prevents that from happening, because that would likely be unacceptable to the Commission and indeed the Court of Justice of the European Union. Again, this is not something that the UK government has spoken about much publicly, but in private conversations, they have effectively confirmed that that's what they anticipate. Although, interestingly, they were not keen on the term geofencing, but when I spoke with representatives, they agreed that technical and legal measures to prevent that kind of onward transfer from the UK would likely be necessary. So what does that mean for the UK's adequacy from the EU? Well, the first thing to say is that the new lower standard for UK adequacy is not the only change that's being brought in with the bill. It's part of a family of changes which weaken data rights in the UK. However, it's quite unlikely that that family of changes, significant though they are, undermine the standard of data protection in the UK sufficiently that the Commission would be minded to withdraw the UK's adequacy decision immediately, or even when it comes up for renewal. Over time, that picture might look quite different. It remains to be seen if geofencing needs to be put in place, what that will look like, how it will work, will it actually be properly implemented in practice, or will you have a kind of a veneer of geofencing, technical or legal, but a reality of data moving from the EU to the UK and onwards to other destinations? You could also see objections to some of the changes around law enforcement processing that the bill's bringing in, and objections to other changes like the fact that the ICO is probably going to be less independent once the bill passes. So whilst I don't think there's likely to be a change on day one that the bill passes, it's quite possible that you could see a challenge being brought by campaigners, a legal challenge before the Court of Justice of the EU, in the fullness of time. So it leaves quite a big question mark, I would say, over the UK's ongoing adequacy decision from the EU. In terms of what this means for consumers, well, in the short term, not very much, because it's all a question of how the UK actually makes use of the greater freedom that it's giving itself through the passing of the Data Protection Bill. It's also worth saying that an ordinary consumer isn't particularly aware of what's going on with their data anyway. But as the UK starts to use those freedoms, you could well see things starting to shift for UK consumers and potentially EU consumers as well. But probably, again, not in a way that individual ordinary people would notice. There's likely to be a reliance on civil society and campaigners to understand what's going on and challenge it if appropriate. One thing I will mention is that the bill removes the requirement for international controllers to appoint an Article 27 representative inside the UK. And that is something that on day one could make it quite a bit more difficult for UK data subjects to enforce their rights. If the UK were to lose adequacy from the EU in the fullness of time, obviously that is something that you would kind of feel as a consumer on a day-to-day level, because that would be a huge change and would really affect the kind of services that people are using on a daily basis. So yeah, that's how things are changing, and a little bit more detail on how it could affect adequacy. That's me done, to be clear.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. Thank you for that presentation. Yanis?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be on this webinar as well. I don't want to repeat the points the previous speakers already made. Javier gave us a presentation of the briefing and how the UK is essentially trying to become a data haven, and Alex at the same time showed us how dangerous the country's approach can be for international data flows, as evidenced through the currently debated bill. My short contribution will offer an additional perspective as to why the UK bill and its strong chance to degrade privacy standards will ultimately harm digital trade too. I will first discuss some of the most problematic provisions contained in the bill that are not data flow related. And then I will briefly illustrate how these provisions cast serious doubts to both the UK's ability to comply with its international obligations, as well as to maintain sustainable digital trade partnerships. So to begin with, first with the bill, we often see privacy and data protection to be regarded by governments as trade barriers. And in that vein, the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill that followed the publication of the government's response to Data in New Direction consultation was first laid before the Parliament in July 2022, and now we have the bill number 2 that was that replaced that one and was laid before Parliament this last March. Privacy International submitted lengthy comments to the 2022 original consultation, highlighting basically how the governmental proposal seeks to undermine individuals' rights on several fronts under the cloak of promoting innovation. Some key features of the bill in its current form include provisions aimed at introducing new government powers to approve international data transfers, as Alex explained, weakening data subjects' rights by, for example, making it easier for companies to delay or even refuse data subject access requests, new grounds for processing personal data, even more exceptions from the purpose limitation principle, as well as changes in the definition of what constitutes personal data, and a serious blow to the independence of the ICO, the UK data protection regulator. I'll be focusing on the last two, namely personal data definition and the ICO independence, as they're the most relevant for the point I'm trying to make. For example, the bill currently appears to create confusion by amending the definition of personal data. Most notably, that's a wording that information may be personal data if it is not sufficiently protected via appropriate measures that mitigate the risk of unauthorized persons obtaining this information. And understandably, this raises the question as to whether personal data becomes somehow magically anonymized, so long as controllers maintain appropriate technical measures, which has nothing to do with the original definition of personal data. With regard to the changes pertaining to the ICO, the text of the bill obliges the Information Commissioner to take into account the government's strategic priorities on data when exercising his duties. It also gives him the discretion to dismiss complaints unless individuals have already complained to an organization and company first. Overall, and as Open Rights Group, for example, has put it, we see an effort to politicize the ICO, which is something we're used to as being an independent data regulator. Now, there's 2 points that are worth making with regard to how these proposals can put the UK international obligations in digital trade at jeopardy. The first ties in with what Alex's presentation touched on. While the UK might think it's done with the EU that easy, this is clearly not the case, as its data governance would still have to offer an equivalent level of protection to that of the EU if the UK wants to continue sharing data with all EU member states. More importantly, as the SREMS and SREMS 2 cases confirmed, the Court of Justice of the EU would also look at the relevant Strasbourg jurisprudence to determine the standards that ought to govern the transfers of data. And on a somewhat related note, in its recent and landmark judgment in 10 human rights orgs versus the United Kingdom, we saw the court, the European Court of Human Rights, that is, underline the importance of independent authorization in the context of bulk surveillance. The second and equally important point relates to how the UK might be failing to comply with its obligations under another treaty it is part of, this time the Council of Europe Convention for the Protection of Individuals with regard to automatic processing of personal data, also known as Convention 108. Convention 108 was adopted in 1981 and was the first legally binding international instrument on data protection. It has been ratified by all Council of Europe member states, including the UK, but not just that, it's also ratified by countries from all over the globe, and this includes, among others, Argentina, Mexico, Tunisia, and Uruguay. It's also worth noting that in 2018, Convention 108 underwent a modernization process, which among others sought to set higher standards for the protection of individuals' personal data in light of the equivalent EU privacy reforms, such as the GDPR and the Law Enforcement Directive that took place in 2016. Needless to say, to refer back to the 2 points on definition of personal data and ICO independence, that the convention defines personal data as any information relating to an identified or identifiable individual, similar to the EU data protection legislation, such as the GDPR or the Law Enforcement Directive. And it also establishes a series of obligations that the parties to the convention need to transpose into their national legal frameworks. And this, of course, raises compatibility questions when it comes to the proposed changes contained in the bill as to how the UK will eventually live up to these obligations, to its international obligations as contained in Convention 108. Finally, and to make the connection with trade, it's easy to see how this data reform proposal that is praised in the name of innovation can actually harm both individuals' rights and trade. Solutions like the ones I mentioned above, as the measures that the bill seeks to introduce, can create even further problems, like data localization rules, which under the guise of protecting data, end up facilitating the exploitation of data by local governments and corporations. At the same time, no private company whose activities expand globally or cross-jurisdictionally would potentially want to invest in such a data laundering scheme. This is why it is important to always consider fundamental rights, including the right to privacy, as a starting point for any digital trade discussion. And this is even more the case why we need a system where our data flows within our control and alongside our rights, not a data Wild West that the bill will potentially establish. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanis. Thank you. We are now open to take questions from the audience. While we wait for the audience to ask their question, I would like to start with a few questions for our speakers today.
I think you have a chat. Sorry, we got Emily Jones, her hand raised.
Sure.
I just saw.
Emily, can you maybe type the question if it's possible?
Oh, I think I've just got speaking rights.
Oh,
can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I just wondered if you, thank you for really, really insightful presentations there. I wondered if you might speak a little bit to the political economy dynamics of what's shaping the UK's shift away from the EU sort of approach, and which voices, I know you said that sort of scrutiny and transparency are lacking in this space. I just wondered where you think, or which groups within society, and if there's particular interest groups that are having an influence over UK trade policy, or where this direction is really coming from, or whether it's sort of driven from within government and within policy. Thank you.
Yeah, should I mean, I think Alex will also, and Yanis will have some views. I mean, in my understanding is that there is some interest mainly from the tech sector, like and particularly, but with a weird situation where there are international large tech companies and small tech companies. You know, they are potentially a little bit divided. There were some small companies that thought that actually some of the new data regulations could benefit mainly large technology companies. Now, from what we understand, some business groups like the CBI at some point, or the UK and the International Chamber of Commerce in the UK, they have mainly raised concerns around the loss of EU adequacy and the disruptions of trade with the EU. So I think that then more broadly, I think that there are many other groups that are not, at this point, are not very certain that UK trade more broadly beyond digital is actually working, like particularly if you look at farmers and some food producers. So I think that there is, and I think civil society are definitely the big, the mainly ignored group in this whole discussion, as far as I can tell. But I don't know, Alex, you've been in touch with other groups. I don't know if you have
No, I think it's pretty accurate. I mean, I guess I would add, it's not even that clear that business were pushing particularly strongly for the changes in the Data Protection Digital Information Bill. Whilst they probably can see some advantages, I think we need to be mindful that as much as anything else, it's being put through as effectively like a post-Brexit political win to demonstrate a degree of divergence from the European Union as much as it is for kind of real economic benefits.
And actually, just briefly, if you look at the impact assessments, for example, of the UK-Japan trade agreement, when it comes to goods, there is at least an attempt to quantify the benefits and to look at the sectors and regions. When it comes to services and digital, what you have is simply completely, I mean, I wouldn't say completely random multiplier, but just like a quite arbitrary figure to say, yeah, and this is going to increase trade by X. And when we actually prodded at some point, I tried to get an answer from the department on where they got that figure, and they said that it was basically just like they just made it up. Basically, that was the reality. And I think that is an ongoing problem with the services, but particularly digital trade.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you, Alex. We have Christopher Foster. Yanis, would you like to add anything to that?
No, not really. I think pretty much what Alex and Javier said covered me, but I was just going to touch on the point about how companies themselves may also question the so-called strategic decisions and the provisions contained in the bill, as we have seen based on their responses to consultations, that while they welcome some of these changes, understandably, because it was supposed to relieve burden placed on companies, at the same time, they also questioned the political motivation behind the introduction of certain provisions, and they also expressed objections, which made it ever more interesting to see that also the tech or company sector might have some objections against the data reform bill.
Thank you, Yanis. Christopher, you can ask your question now.
Hi, can you hear me okay? I'm guessing you can. Yeah, I just wanted to, thanks for a really interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask about this. So, I mean, I guess what you're saying really is that for UK, more maybe than other countries in the world, is really going to have quite different rules maybe around data flows related to kind of how they're relating to different areas of the world. So I'm just kind of curious about like how firms see this. Is this something that's viable, that you particularly kind of multinational firms or firms which are acting more globally, that they're going to be able to deal with these kind of variation of rules kind of linked to different types of data that they're dealing with? Or like what's their response to these kind of things? I'm kind of curious of like how viable this is in practice, of having this kind of sitting on the fence and kind of taking different rules in different places. Thanks.
So I can open a bit. So if you ask so you have like several elements that come together in this idea of the data flows. So on the one hand, you have a genuine concern about certain countries pushing for what is called like this data localization or proper divergence, whether it's China with their whole firewall, like creating a completely different regime, or even countries like Vietnam, but also from the US perspective, the EU regulation of privacy is also perceived as divergent. So there is a concern from companies, definitely, that they cannot move data. Now, in practice, the global economy has not really ground to a halt because companies cannot move data. And that's so there is a lot of fear, and all this, quite frankly, business funded in the main think tanks, have been proposing this idea that there is a crisis. There is a crisis in terms of like the geopolitics of digital regulation beyond data, and I think that a crisis of human rights and a crisis of semiconductors industry and Russian wars and things like that, and I think that we cannot deny that there is a problem, but I think that there is a quite specific focus or only on data as the main thing, and I think that the problem may be wider. Now, when it comes to data, could this work? I mean, I think that what we are seeing in examples where countries are trying to do this, it tends to work. And this is my personal theory at this point, but based on the evidence from Japan and the US at the moment on the EU-Japan adequacy and the US trade, so the US privacy shield, so that what you will create is called data enclaves. So the idea is that you can create places like special economic zones or something where you can apply different rules, and those data come to those places, and then you can have like a limited type of processing, but then the data cannot completely flow to the others. So I don't think that you can have the full Monty, of data flowing completely freely. But what you have, for example, in the Japan adequacy decision from the EU is a ban on onwards transfers of EU data. So it's what Alex was mentioned before, like a geofencing or data segregation, depending on where the data comes. Now, what you can say is that who is going to ensure that those things are actually done by companies? What kind of data analytics you can do with data that doesn't require data being transferred, but you can. I think what the UK will probably see is that data comes to the UK from different places. It doesn't go anywhere else, but it's then processed and gets the added value in the UK, and then the results of the data, the insights or the value somehow get transferred across. So I think that is the kind of thing that probably will make this thing operational in a way. But then, of course, there are many problems that what no one is looking at this point is how to make sure, for example, that consumers and data rights are enforceable across jurisdictions. So if your data ends up a couple of hops, the mechanisms at the moment are not really there for this thing to work. So when they're talking about interoperability tends to stop the moment that the data is transferred. So it's all about finding legal mechanisms for transferring data. But then once that the data is there, there is very limited discussion on how to carry other protections or, I don't know, Alex, do you may have a theory again, or Yanis, about this?
No theories. I guess I would just say in terms of handling this change, I wouldn't see big problems for large companies that are already doing lots of international data transfers and personal data originating say, the UK, EU, and the US, where you would expect maybe the regulatory burden to fall as a result of these changes is more on the mid-sized companies, maybe companies that are just processing data originating in the EU and the UK, because they'll have fewer resources to deal with these changes, but they'll be at the kind of sharp end of these issues around geofencing, for example. So that's changes and costs.
Yeah. And also just to add, I mean, the costs, I mean, I think that the idea of CBPR, so if CBPR, or the APEC regime is a private certification system, which means that you have to pay a private company to certify your data processes, which means some sort of audit, which means for a large company is something closer to what is called the business, like business corporate rules in the EU regime, and those can cost easily hundreds of thousands of euros. Because you need, I mean, at the moment they're done by the regulators in the EU, in the UK, and there are very few amongst other reasons because they're very expensive and very intrusive. So it's not clear that these alternative regulatory regimes will actually work at the scale for small companies. I mean, I think that's just not the case. Yeah.
Thank you, Javier. Alex, any further questions from the audience? Looks like we don't have any other questions. Any last thoughts, panelists?
No, I think I've said enough.
Okay, so thank you, Alex, Yanis, and Javier for a wonderful webinar today. It was very, very informative. And thank you to all the attendees for attending this webinar. I would again like to remind you that the report can be accessed from DTA website. I'm again sharing a link in the chat. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.